of walls and carpets and curtains, all of the coldest description. Everything was handsome and everything was ugly. Mrs Bradshaw was asleep in her easy chair when they came in. Jemima had just put down her work, and, lost in thought, she leaned her cheek on her hand. When she saw Ruth, she brightened a little, and went to her and kissed her. Mrs Bradshaw jumped up at the sound of their entrance, and was wide awake in a moment. "Oh, I thought your father was here," said she, evidently relieved to find that he had not come in and caught her sleeping. "Thank you, Mrs Denbigh, for coming to us to night," said she, in the quiet tone in which she generally spoke in her husband's absence. When he was there, a sort of constant terror of displeasing him made her voice sharp and nervous. The children knew that many a thing passed over by their mother when their father was away was sure to be noticed by her when he was present, and noticed, too, in a cross and querulous manner, for she was so much afraid of the blame which, on any occasion of their misbehaviour, fell upon her. And yet she looked up to her husband with a reverence and regard, and a faithfulness of love, which his decision of character was likely to produce on a weak and anxious mind. He was a rest and a support to her, on whom she cast all her responsibilities. She was an obedient, unremonstrating wife to him. No stronger affection had ever brought her duty into conflict with any desire of her heart. She loved her children dearly, though they all perplexed her very frequently. Her son was her especial darling, because he very seldom brought her into any scrapes with his father. He was so cautious and prudent, and had the art of keeping a calm soul about any difficulty he might be in. With all her dutiful sense of the obligation which her husband enforced upon her, to notice and tell him everything that was going wrong in the household, and especially among his children, Mrs Bradshaw somehow contrived to be honestly blind to a good deal that was not praiseworthy in Master Richard. Mr Bradshaw came in before long, bringing with him Mr Farquhar. Jemima had been talking to Ruth with some interest before then, but on seeing Mr Farquhar, she bent her head down over her work, went a little paler, and then turned obstinately silent. Mr Bradshaw longed to command her to speak, but even he had a suspicion that what she might say, when so commanded, might be rather worse in its effect than her gloomy silence, so he held his peace, and a discontented, angry kind of peace it was. Mrs Bradshaw saw that something was wrong, but could not tell what. Only she became every moment more trembling and nervous and irritable, and sent Mary and Elizabeth off on all sorts of contradictory errands to the servants, and made the tea twice as strong, and sweetened it twice as much as usual, in hopes of pacifying her husband with good things. Mr Farquhar had gone for the last time, or so he thought. He had resolved, for the 5th time, that he would go and watch Jemima once more, and if her temper got the better of her, and she showed the old sullenness again, and gave the old proofs of indifference to his good opinion, he would give her up altogether, and seek a wife elsewhere. He sat watching her with folded arms, and in silence. Altogether, they were a pleasant family party. Jemima wanted to wind a skein of wool. Mr Farquhar saw it, and came to her, anxious to do her this little service. She turned away pettishly, and asked Ruth to hold it for her. Ruth was hurt for Mr Farquhar, and looked sorrowfully at Jemima, but Jemima would not see her glance of upbraiding, as Ruth, hoping that she would relent, delayed a little to comply with her request. Mr Farquhar did, and went back to his seat to watch them both. He saw Jemima, turbulent and stormy in look. He saw Ruth, to all appearance heavenly calm as the angels, or with only that little tinge of sorrow which her friend's behaviour had called forth. He saw the unusual beauty of her face and form, which he had never noticed before; and he saw Jemima, with all the brilliancy she once possessed in eyes and complexion, dimmed and faded. He watched Ruth, speaking low and soft to the little girls, who seemed to come to her in every difficulty, and he remarked her gentle firmness when their bedtime came, and they pleaded to stay up longer. Their father was absent in his counting house, or they would not have dared to do so. He liked Ruth's soft, distinct, unwavering, "No, you must go, you must keep to what is right," far better than the good-natured yielding to entreaty he had formerly admired in Jemima. He was wandering off into this comparison, while Ruth, with delicate and unconscious tact, was trying to lead Jemima into some subject which should take her away from the thoughts, whatever they were, that made her so ungracious and rude. Jemima was ashamed of herself before Ruth, in a way which she had never been before any one else. She valued Ruth's good opinion so highly, that she dreaded lest her friend should perceive her faults. She put a check upon herself a check at first, but after a little time she had forgotten something of her trouble, and listened to Ruth, and questioned her about Leonard, and smiled at his little witticisms, and only the sighs that would come up from the very force of habit brought back the consciousness of her unhappiness. Before the end of the evening, Jemima had allowed herself to speak to Mr Farquhar in the old way, questioning, differing, disputing. She was recalled to the remembrance of that miserable conversation by the entrance of her father. After that she was silent; but he had seen her face more animated, and bright with a smile, as she spoke to Mr Farquhar; and although he regretted the loss of her complexion, for she was still very pale, he was highly pleased with the success of his project. He never doubted but that Ruth had given her some sort of private exhortation to behave better. He could not have understood the pretty art with which, by simply banishing unpleasant subjects, and throwing a wholesome, natural, sunlit tone over others, Ruth had insensibly drawn Jemima out of her gloom. He resolved to buy Mrs Denbigh a handsome silk gown the very next day. He did not believe she had a silk gown, poor creature. He had noticed that dark grey stuff this long time as her Sunday dress. He liked the colour; the silk one should be just the same tinge. Then he thought that it would perhaps be better to choose a lighter shade, one which might be noticed as different to the old gown; for he had no doubt she would like to have it remarked, and perhaps would not object to tell people that it was a present from Mr Bradshaw, a token of his approbation. He smiled a little to himself as he thought of this additional source of pleasure to Ruth. She, in the meantime, was getting up to go home. While Jemima was lighting the bed candle at the lamp, Ruth came round to bid good night. Mr Bradshaw could not allow her to remain till the morrow, uncertain whether he was satisfied or not. "Good night, Mrs Denbigh," said he. "Good night. Thank you. I am obliged to you. I am exceedingly obliged to you." He laid emphasis on these words, for he was pleased to see Mr Farquhar step forward to help Jemima in her little office. Mr Farquhar offered to accompany Ruth home, but the streets that intervened between Mr Bradshaw's and the Chapel House were so quiet that he desisted, when he learned from Ruth's manner how much she disliked his proposal. Mr Bradshaw, too, instantly observed, "Oh, Mrs Denbigh need not trouble you, Farquhar. I have servants at liberty at any moment to attend to her if she wishes it." In fact, he wanted to make hay while the sun shone, and to detain Mr Farquhar a little longer, now that Jemima was so gracious. She went upstairs with Ruth to help her put on her things. "Dear Jemima," said Ruth, "I am so glad to see you looking better to night. You quite frightened me this morning, you looked so ill." "Did I?" replied Jemima. "Oh, Ruth, I have been so unhappy lately. I want you to come and put me to rights," she continued, half smiling. "You know I'm a sort of out pupil of yours, though we are so nearly of an age. You ought to lecture me, and make me good." "Should I, dear?" said Ruth. "I don't think I'm the one to do it." "Oh, yes, you are. You've done me